All right, so this is episode number 3 of Out of Left Field. What's the topic today, Ben?
The topic today is anarchism.
Yeah, it's a topic we agreed on because we're both interested in anarchism, not necessarily for the same reasons.
Well, sort of, aren't we?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I've met anarchists before, but I've always been more of it's been more of a curiosity for me than a real sort of part of my life.
Oh, you're bringing up that old nugget, eh?
Yep.
Well, yes. I'll admit I was an anarchist at one point. I was very young. It was many moons ago. But no, I kind of get it. You know, you don't like capitalism and you want more democracy, and that kind of makes sense. And wouldn't it be great if things could just work out that way? So no, I get it as a philosophy, but I don't think it really stands up to intense criticism. I think there's some creases that need to be ironed out there.
Yeah, I mean, I've ostensibly met anarchists, although other anarchists have told me they weren't anarchists, and those original anarchists said the second group weren't. So I'm still at a bit of a loss as to what exactly anarchism is. I mean, that to me seems to be the biggest problem with anarchism, is that there doesn't seem to be a hell of a lot of agreement on what to do, who to do it with, or when.
Well, you could kind of say the same thing about socialists, too, to some extent. I mean, there's a lot of different, splintered leftist groups that all are in slightly, different directions. The Spartacus League doesn't think that the International Socialists are real socialists, and the IS doesn't think that the IMT are real socialists because of these small details. So, I don't know. It's not like that's unique to anarchism, per se.
Yeah, but it does also seem like those other, socialists have clear definitions for the organizations they're members of and who are and are not members. And anarchists seem to almost relish in not having those clear dividing points.
Well, otherwise it's almost like a state, and we have to be anti-statist, right, to be an anarchist.
Well, that does seem to, I guess that is like the only real uniting factor amongst all anarchists. Is a hatred, dislike, disdain, distrust of the state.
And any hierarchy or authority, really. I mean,
yeah.
They don't, not all anarchists, but many of them just don't even like the concept of police officers and how that they're a symbol of authority. I guess maybe that's probably more just the black bloc anarchists, which are everyone's least favorite, of course, because they're the ones smashing windows and Starbucks and shit during protests.
Yeah, I don't like them at all. I'll go out on a limb and say it. I don't like the black bloc. I know it's a tough thing to admit to.
It's not a tough thing to admit to.
No, it's really not.
I don't think many people do like the black bloc.
Well,
even probably other anarchists.
Yeah, I mean, what I dislike about them is how they use honest people in protests as human shields for their shenanigans.
Well, they don't have protests of their own.
Well, they couldn't. They just get arrested.
Yeah.
Right away. Almost immediately. It would be the same thing if someone, say, smashed a car window downtown. And
just
then
randomly.
and then someone just calls the police, and the police show up, and people get arrested, and that's the end of that.
Yeah, and then they might complain about police brutality.
Well, and police brutality does happen, but my point is just that the protest wouldn't occur, because there wouldn't be anything that would actually happen. There wouldn't be, there's no coherent goal to things like the black bloc. They seem to dislike the state, but that's about it. There doesn't seem to go beyond that. It's not like they have a message that they're trying to tell people about.
And maybe that's the one thing that makes them classified as anarchists at all, is that they do hate the state and they do hate capitalism, and they're probably different than most other anarchists on most other issues. But because I think most anarchists would say that the black bloc doesn't represent them at all. But they're still there, and they're still, present, and they still certainly capture a lot of media attention, much to everyone else's dismay. So they're, definitely worth mentioning.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, it might very well just be that they're kind of a almost like a natural disaster. You just have to sort of deal with it when it happens, and then the day afterwards, they just sort of disappear into the ether again, and
into the underground.
Yeah, or wherever they end up. I mean, there's lots of anarchists who don't like put on black clothes and march together and smash things. There's anarchists who break the laws in a variety of other ways that are more about direct action against particular aspects of society they find to be sort of evil.
Well, breaking the law is often necessary when protesting, so that's fair. It's not like they're doing it because they want to break the law.
No, well, hopefully not. Seems like a rather petty and stupid goal.
Yeah.
If you just want to break the law, there's easier ways to do it.
Well, you could just like jaywalk all day if you wanted to do
Back
that.
and forth across the street to smash the state.
Well, I don't know. I think most people would. The first person they would think of when they hear the word anarchist is Noam Chomsky. He's definitely the most famous anarchist, ever, probably.
Yeah, and he certainly isn't he's not really known with breaking laws or even really associating himself so much with people who do. He's a pretty well-established academic who is sort of promoting a lot of these central ideas in anarchism.
Well, I think Noam Chomsky talks a lot more about U.S. foreign policy and criticizing it and criticizing the status quo and the way things are, but doesn't really say much about what he thinks should actually happen. And that really might be a reason why so many different anarchists really admire him and can relate to what he says, because he's not taking a firm position on, like, I am an anarcho-syndicalist, or I am an anarcho-primitivist, or I am a green anarchist, or an anarcho-capitalist, or whatever else. He doesn't say any of those things. He just focuses his efforts on the wrong things about the current state of affairs. And, I can still read Chomsky or listen to him on the news and agree with almost pretty much everything he says, right? So, he doesn't take real firm positions. And, maybe that's calculated, or maybe, he just wants to let people themselves decide. But, I do think it's something that he could improve, because you still should bring ideas to the table that will try to move things forward.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't read a whole lot of his stuff, but he does seem to be pretty good at criticizing things and not nearly as vocal about what he actually wants. I don't know if that's a calculated move or anything. It might just be that he's sort of, as an academic, he sees it as his job in academia to criticize American foreign policy. That's just sort of the area of expertise he finds himself in.
As a linguist?
Well, sure. I mean, that's like his professional training. That's his actual expertise. But I mean, just in sort of the political sense.
Right. Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, what? I suppose that's probably enough about Chomsky. Like, what? Where do you find that you really disagree with anarchists, in the sense that, like, okay, we're both leftists. We all think that capitalism should end. But where do we differ?
Probably on the most basic issues of organization. Even just from a philosophical standpoint of just like what organizations are for, what their goals are. It seems like in sort of an anarchist mindset that the goal of an organization is to be kind of a symbolic of the society you're trying to build. That is kind of like a microcosm of this future world that anarchism is trying to achieve. Whereas in socialism, it seems much more pragmatic, and it's just whatever will get to the goal that is specifically on the agenda. If there's a law that should be passed, then that's what political parties need to be organized to do. If there's a protest that needs to take place, you organize, an activist group that will then get those protests started up. There's no real specific ideological relevance to how the organizations exist, in so much as just they are there to be useful,
right,
and not so much there to be like a symbol of socialism,
Right. Well, anarchists really do stress consensus a lot and really flat organizational structures, which is a whole other conversation. I have so many problems with consensus. I think it's such a very bad way to organize. I mean, you do want to have everyone have a chance to say their piece, but you can't have one person hold up the whole train the whole time. But I don't know. I find that even though anarchists do put a lot of emphasis on these flat organizational structures, there always seems to be the same people that are organizing them all the time that seem to hold a lot more influence in the groups anyway. Mm-hmm. And no one elected them to lead the group. They just happen to be the most active person. And I think that if you want a democratic society, you have to practice real democracy. If you're going to have people that, like in a group that's official, they should be elected.
Yeah, I think that's just a contradiction, though, in the way that the society anarchists want the organizations that are supposed to be indicative of that society, and the fact that we don't yet live in a society capable of doing that kind of like 100% agreement type of thing, where consensus isn't really easy to achieve, and that's part of the problem. What that means is that when you try to sort of artificially create an environment in which consensus is necessarily required, it just ends up being a complete shit show.
It really does.
I mean, if you ever ask, for 100% agreement, and you have more than just a couple of people in the room, what you're basically saying is every single person in this room has the right to veto anything anyone else in this room wants to do.
And at that point, it's the rule of the lowest common denominator.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where it so doesn't work, like it's so non-functional, that it almost requires that there be that small group of people who are actually doing the real work in the background.
Well, I don't think it's something that can be applied to society overall, definitely. But I think it's almost like they want to have these small groups that function on consensus, to have, like you said, these small organs in society, so that they can be at peace with themselves and be like, well, I'm working in this small democratic group and I'm making this world a better place just doing this one little thing. And sure, but the rest of the society can't partake in that. It has to be something that's focused towards something that can help everyone.
Yeah, but you're implying that these organizations are actually supposed to, that their purpose, that the goal that they were created for was to actually change society and not just allow for a small group of people to feel good about themselves. And
that kind of reminds me of liberalism a bit. Feel good, like, yeah, I'll buy this particular product.
Recycle organic, or whatever.
Yeah, and, not that I'm against recycling. I recycle everything I can. But, it's that in and of itself isn't going to change the reason, change the functions of society and the whole root of these problems.
Sure, with recycling, it's like the purpose of recycling is to help the environment, right? Mm-hmm. But if you're really concerned about the environment, then recycling isn't nearly good enough. But it is good enough if you want to feel like you're making a difference.
Yeah. Kind of like giving to charity, which, again, not against. We need to have charity and NGOs to help those in need, but the whole reason we need charity in the first place is because the society, or the economics and capitalism, creates poverty, and that's the problem. You can't just put band-aids on it. But anyways, we're sort of wandering off the point now. I think that anarchists focus on direct action as the means upon which you get to your end goal is misguided, to say the least. I don't, and again, with the emphasis on individual action, if you really want to change society, you need to do it as a group with other people, and it has to be a broad working class movement. It can't just be a few anarchist operatives,
Yeah, the idea that I guess it was like a small group of people who sort of inspire the rest of society to act, whatever that might mean. I mean, I have a hard time understanding how we get from where we are today to anarchism, given the methods that anarchism is willing to use.
Well, everyone could just wake up, you know.
What does that even mean?
They'll see.
That's a metaphor, right? I mean, you don't literally mean wake up. And I know that you don't, and I know that people who use that phrase don't literally mean wake up, but what do they mean?
I don't know. Have you seen Waking Life? Maybe they do literally mean that.
I don't know. That's just one of those phrases when you're sort of appealing to these idealistic notions instead of a concrete plan of action. It's just, well, we're just going to keep leafleting until people wake up. We're going to keep, protesting until, those guys in government have to listen to us. Or any of these kind of those are just propagandistic phrases that have no real relevance when it comes to actual politics.
So, what is a concrete plan of action then?
Well, I think in the short term, it's really just a matter of education. It's a matter of organizing people, whatever numbers you can find, and just discussing these ideas, debating them, coming to some serious conclusions, and then trying to apply that when events occur in society.
So you don't think that anarchists don't do that already?
Well, they might, but I think that the distinction here is about coming to a concrete conclusion. That is as important as the debate process itself. Actually being able to come to a decision that you stick to and actually try and apply in whatever means you can. So if you think that there's a problem in society and you, with whoever you have around you, you're able to discuss these ideas, debate them seriously, and then try to actually implement them in some way. That's the difference. I don't think anarchism is particularly concerned with the implementation part or about the coming to a concrete conclusion. I mean, there are no real concrete conclusions in anarchism. It's just a matter of whether or not the people in that particular room agree at that particular time. Any decision can pretty much be nullified at any moment. Whereas in a socialist organization, decisions are made, debates do occur, but there is always the understanding that the purpose of debate is to come to a specific conclusion that the group actually has to, adhere to.
Whether you agree with the final decision or not.
Yeah.
There's democracy in coming to that conclusion, and everyone can debate and have their piece, but you still have to remain united as a group. Otherwise, you'll just get splintered and there will be factionalism.
Yeah, and one of two things either happens in the alternative. One is the factionalism thing, or, and I think this is one of the major problems with anarchism today, is that these serious debates don't really ever occur, and there's this false sense of agreement because no one really wants to have the whole thing break apart.
Well, maybe that's a reason, too, why they sort of shy away from politics. Most anarchists don't even vote because they don't want to sort of participate in the system.
Yeah, at all. If they participate, I don't know what the specific idea is, but I think it's like, if you participate in the system, you legitimize it, and if you legitimize it, then you are no longer able to be against it at a later date, or something along those lines?
Well, I think they don't want to give any sorts of, false credit to the system, like, my vote doesn't matter anyways, we're always just going to have some sort of crappy political leader, and they don't want to have a society that has hierarchy or authority in it anyways, and I think that voting is almost just recognizes that, and they'd rather just, hands off completely.
Well, I don't have any sour grapes about hierarchies or capitalism. If something good happens in capitalism, it's still good. If a politician does something, and even if I don't particularly like the politician, if they do something I think is a good idea, I'll just say so. I'm not going to just dismiss everything that could possibly happen because there's some aspect of it I don't like.
Even if almost all aspects of it you don't like.
No, I particularly don't like a whole hell of a lot about our political system at all. I think it's poorly thought out and archaic in most ways.
Yeah, I agree. And you still don't want people to vote for something that they don't want anyway, so I can understand that why an anarchist wouldn't want to vote for any of the given candidates. But also the fact that having a political party is not anarchistic. You know, that's just not something they do.
It's just not on.
And I think is one of my biggest qualms with it, because I think that the most effective way to change society is if a left-wing government could come to power and use the power of the state to make those good changes. And I think that's the only way that it can happen. And I think by ignoring the political system and just surrendering that whole theater of war over to whoever else wants to fight it, I think is not a good strategy.
Well, it'd be like saying that you should fight. You should go on strike, but you should never sign a contract with the boss. You know, because to do that is to sort of compromise with capitalism, and that's just not allowed. And there are anarchists who think that is the way that strikes should be done. That unions should be just sort of constantly on the attack, that there should never be any attempt to compromise with capitalism, because to do that is to sort of undermine the validity of the entire movement.
Are anarchists pro-union most of the time? I don't even know.
Well, I mean, you've got the anarcho-syndicalists who are definitely pro-union. They're
Of course.
very pro-union.
Right.
That's like
The
their whole deal is that they're pro-union. So yeah, I mean, you can have anarchists who organize in ways that don't contradict their stance on the state, at least in any significant way. They can have, unions. And in some cases, like historically at least, anarchists did have political parties. So that
Really?
that wasn't a contradiction at one time.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, about 50 to 100 years ago now, anarchists around the world were sort of mingled with socialists in many ways, or had their own political parties.
Right.
And that wasn't a problem. The whole point was they were fighting capitalism, and you just fight it in whatever way you have available to you. And that's just that.
So at what point did it change?
I don't know. I think it was sort of a transitional period over several decades. But I mean, in Canada, it was over between like the 1920s up to the 1940s, where the anarchists and socialists formed socialist parties, and the anarchists either became socialists or they dropped out of the political movement altogether.
Because they felt like no gains could be made through it?
Yeah, well, a lot of these socialists in that era and even today have, caused backsliding of workers' rights and have, undermined the conditions of decent people, that they've done things that were, they colluded with capitalism in many cases. And so I think there was an idea that politics was so inherently corrupting that you just couldn't even touch it.
Well, there has been, over time, a sort of colluding of the bureaucracy of the labor movement with the state and with the political system, and I can understand trying to distance yourself from that, but I think that's a more important battle to fight. How the left in the Canadian Labour Congress recently pushed for the election of the new leader, and he's really pro grassroots, pro rank and file, and he is really against a lot of the sort of colluding and backroom deals that the labor bureaucracy has done with the Canadian government over the recent years, and that's a really important change in the scene here. And I think that, like, an anarchist movement not wanting to take part in anything like that can't make those gains and can't make those connections with the broader working class.
Yeah, they're sort of, whether by their own desires or just by the necessity of their philosophy, they are left on their own to depend on themselves and no one else.
Well, on the other hand, it is all about direct action, right?
Yeah, that is not only a major point of anarchism, it is probably the way in which most people ever actually see anarchists. It is kind of the only thing they really do that involves interacting with all of the rest of society. I mean, you have these, you have meetings and stuff, but admittedly, they never get to any real significant size. And that's not really a slight against anarchism. That's just a fact of those kinds of meetings. You just get the few people who are really interested coming to these meetings, and then the rest of society, what they see are the direct action of a major protest or a sit-in or some kind of thing that just happens, and then it ends,
Except in the times when they will find a particular topic that really strikes people. For example, a couple of years ago, before the Enbridge pipeline was actually approved, like it was just recently there were a few meetings in town that were organized by the local anarchists, and they actually had a pretty big turnout. Like, the place was kind of packed.
30, 40, 50 people. I don't know how many it was, but it was just full.
And that might not sound like a lot to big city people, but here in Victoria...
This is a big city.
It's a medium city.
So 400,000 people live in Victoria.
Most people would say that's a small city.
Well, those people...
They're wrong.
Those people are wrong.
In any event, they can still have, like, when they organize a meeting that's a discussion on something that people really care about and is really important, they can still have a big turnout. But there's still no real conclusion at the end of the meeting. Like, they don't say, at least in my experience, they don't say, okay, well, we have all these people here, what do we want to do about this problem that we want to solve? It's more just discussions about, underground versus, not underground protesting and, like, tactics, and I don't know. It didn't seem to come to any conclusions.
There wasn't any sign-up sheets or any plan for the next meeting or what we want people to do. It wasn't like they were doling out activities that you can go you can go postering over here. You try to call these people, that kind of stuff. And yeah, I think particularly the email lists and phone number lists and things. A lot of that has to do with just the sort of inherent suspicions that they all have of themselves and each other as far as getting caught doing something.
Well, and also the fact that they don't want to place authority onto any individual because they want to maintain a flat organizational structure, and as soon as you have an organizational committee, you are making a hierarchy, and those people are more important than everyone else in the group. And instead, they end up having one anyway, but it's unofficial, and it's just the people that are most active in the group.
I do think that's worse, because it's not a matter of how much power an individual has, so much as how accountable they are to the rest of the organization.
And
the power that a sort of a secret cabal has in an anarchist movement is quite a lot, and there's no accountability because they don't officially exist.
And they don't have an official position, or they're not elected.
No, they're just the people who always seem to be the ones organizing things and doing stuff and making decisions.
Which is very similar to how Bakunin used to organize back when he was rivals with Marx, I might add.
Yeah, we're getting into history now, and that's not necessarily all that fair because I don't know much about the history of Bakunin and the First International.
Well, I don't think anyone can really say how similar modern anarchism is to Bakunin or old anarchism anyways. I mean, it's kind of subjective.
It's evolved, it's changed. I've never met anarchists that sort of subscribed to his school of thought, so... But to be fair, on the other hand, it is a trend as far as this small group of people running a larger sort of flat organization. It's a trend that seems to happen in anarchism all the time.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't even seem to matter if they have a coherent philosophy they're trying to apply. It's just this idea of trying to do away with a hierarchy just results in this unofficial hierarchy. Instead of saying that there are rules that we will follow in order that there is no abuse of power, it's saying we don't recognize any power, but that doesn't matter because there still are powers that just aren't recognized anymore. And that just makes it easier for those people to abuse that power.
Because they're unaccountable.
They're not only unaccountable, they are necessarily unaccountable. The whole idea is that they don't exist, so that the members of the organization are almost obliged to tell each other and themselves that such a group of people can't possibly exist.
Well, because then you'd be recognizing hierarchy.
Yeah, in an organization that is supposed to explicitly not have any.
Convenient, that.
Well, I don't think it's convenient. I don't think it doesn't require any, like, overt conspiracy on the part of anyone involved. I think it's just a natural development of organizational flabbiness, where you have a group of people who don't want to put themselves under the authority of an organization, and that just results in people who put themselves under the authority of individuals they may not even know, and they can't possibly know about.
Well, I think that these sorts of organizational tactics can sort of work in a small setting, but when you try to apply that to a broader society or to a broader movement, it all falls apart. Like how at the Occupy protests that we had here, that they had this massive turnout and this massive march, and at the end of it, everyone got to the legislative buildings, and with all the people that were organizing Occupy, nobody thought to bring a PA system. And so nobody could hear what the speaker was saying, and everyone was like, oh, well, I guess it's over. So they all just went home. And then that was the pinnacle of the movement. And because no one thought to bring a stupid PA system, that it just kind of ended there. You know, and most of the time when you have actual specific structured organizations, they can organize stages and sound systems and speakers and schedules, and instead of it just being this sort of amorphous symbolic gestural thing.
Yeah, it is a serious concern that when you invest in people the authority to act in your name, they can abuse that power. Not just in a way that they are personally aware of, but in unconscious ways. That they can abuse that power in ways that they're not even really considering at the time, and it just happens as a natural part of the way the organization is run in that kind of person. But none of that goes away just because there isn't an official recognition of an organization. The problem of abuse of power doesn't disappear just because people refuse to recognize the existence of power.
Right.
I mean, people can, steal money or waste each other's time or get you to do things that are in their interest and not in the interest of an organization. And this doesn't even have to do with stuff that's political. This can apply to anything. Any kind of group that you could be a member of can have that kind of stuff happen. But the only way to really protect against it is to have a clear and consistent process for addressing the potential for abuse.
I think any person that has any power should be able to be recalled at any moment. And that's one of Lenin's principles of democracy. Otherwise, there's no real accountability.
Well, yeah, and I think that ironically is one of the major criticisms of our political process, is that we vote for people, we elect people, but they're not accountable because they're basically just in power for however many years.
And people have short memories.
Well, I'm sure people do have short memories, but it doesn't even matter if they had long memories. I mean, even if every time a person did something wrong, we then unelected them at the next election, that's still like years away.
Yeah, and they're still getting paid the same salary.
They're still paid, they're still doing stuff. So even if, like, in year one you said, that guy, I want him out, and people remembered it, it's still like 3-4 years of abuse that we just can't really do anything about.
Yep. Okay, well, let's get to the core of the divisions between anarchism and socialism. Is really about the state and authority. So how would a decentralized anarchist economy differ than a socialist planned economy, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, I don't know about the specifics. In the case of socialism or anarchism, it's not really up to me. It would be decided by a group of people who would have their own opinions on things. Society in general, in the case of anarchism, however that might work. And in the case of socialism, it would be whatever particular governing body is, empowered to address those issues. I think the main difference, though, just in the most general sense, is that anarchism prefers a decentralized economy, and so I think that would probably mean that individual workplaces and towns and things would sort of be run without much concern necessarily for the rest of the world. I mean, there wouldn't really be a way to plan basic sort of international standards of behavior or trade or anything like that. And in the case of socialism, those things would be almost a prerequisite to a socialist economy. You'd have to have those consistent and, equal and understandable means of interacting throughout the whole world. It's what would create the equality under socialism, would be these sort of consistent rules and standards that socialism would be able to meet. And in the case of anarchism, there are no standards, because any such standard would be kind of an imposition on the individuals of that society.
Well, I think that if you just had a decentralized economy, that it would sort of ignore the pre-existing divisions in society that there already are. The communities that are less well off because they don't have as many natural resources are still going to be less well off than the parts that are abundant with them. So I think that if you do want equality, you need to have that national and international program that takes everyone's interests into account, instead of just for some reason saying that you work there so you should own the place. I mean, yes, you should, but you also have to take society's interests into concern as well, not just your own or just of your workplace or just of your community. Everything matters.
Yeah, I mean, it not only just matters. The purpose of the economy under socialism is to produce things to meet the needs of society as a whole, right? And within the context of anarchism, it seems that the purpose of the economy, well, there is no real purpose to the economy. The only thing that matters is whether or not there isn't any imposition on people's behavior.
No state, no hierarchy, that's all that matters.
Yeah, whether or not healthcare is available, whether or not people can read, is secondary to the issue of whether or not people are being forced to do things, either directly or indirectly, through some kind of external authority.
Well, I think anarchists believe that it is the authority that is the cause of the problem. It is the state, it is the hierarchy that is the source of the issue. And capitalism even almost seems secondary to that it's like capitalism is bad because it reinforces hierarchy, not because capitalism as an economic system is fatally flawed.
Yeah, well, yeah, it just does that. I guess that is like the fundamental difference between a socialist and anarchist, is that there's this disagreement between whether or not it's a problem of authority or whether or not it's a problem of the economic system that we're in. That if, for instance, if people were just decent enough not to impose themselves on each other, then there wouldn't be a problem in the first place. But in the case of socialism, the idea is that we actually have to address problems that have developed as a result of human history, and not just because somebody's evil.
Well, it almost seems like to anarchists there are three periods in history: before there was a state, when there is a state, and when there's no state at all, when they get back to that perfect time when there was no state. And it doesn't take into account the different developments and the different ways that society and the economy have changed and how that has driven class divisions in society. It all just seems to come down to authority, and in that sense it shouldn't even matter if you're living under if it's 2,000 years ago or if it's today. I mean, there's a state and there's a state, so what's the difference? But there's plenty of differences, so I don't think it takes into account the details.
Yeah, but the detail, anarchists have never really sweat the details.
Oh, come on.
Well, what?
That's not fair.
It is. I think it is entirely fair
Go on.
to say that. Look, it's just that it's honestly, and I'm going to be really, really honest.
Do it up.
Fine.
Be super honest.
I'll be super honest. I think that anarchists are primarily concerned with feeling better about living in a society they don't like. That the whole point of anarchism is to give them an emotional excuse to avoid actually having to do anything about changing society. If they're an anarchist, it's perfect because they can just be an anarchist, and whether or not their anarchist movement succeeds is irrelevant. All that matters is that moral purity is maintained.
Well, yeah, you're probably right.
That's what frustrates me about anarchism the most, is just this disinterest in like concrete goals and concrete like steps and just things that could just make people's lives better. And like the resources are there, we just have to figure out how to use them properly. But instead it's the state that's always been screwing us over, and there's just like this system in place that's imposing itself on us. And it makes a complete mess of history and human affairs because it doesn't fucking matter what people do anymore. All that matters is whether or not there's a state. It almost doesn't even seem to matter how much we like the anarchist future of tomorrow. I mean, we might all hate it. We might be very, very unhappy with the results. But so long as there's no state, apparently we're supposed to just be like, well, I guess that's just better somehow. I mean, are we supposed to just be satisfied with the moral superiority of living in a stateless society, even if we're living in conditions that are inherently inferior to the ones we're living in now?
Well, that's kind of what anarcho-primitivism is all about.
Yeah,
it was better back then when we were all just small communities.
It's just moralizing sophistry, though. It's just appealing to an era when we don't know about things like the state. We're basically saying that, well, surely we must have been better off before recorded history, because recorded history is full of nothing but suffering.
Well, it's kind of like Golden Age syndrome. Like, the eras when I wasn't alive were certainly much better than the ones now because they had these sort of qualities that I romanticize about that, if I had actually lived there, I would have probably thought that the era before that I lived in it was better because I still didn't understand the qualities before it.
Yeah, and in the context of anarchism, it seems like that society has been getting nothing but worse since the state has been getting stronger and stronger. I mean, in an era of like feudalism, things were better because the state was so much weaker. Well,
I don't know. Anarchists recognize the ills that capitalism has and the bad effect that it has on society and people's conditions. And they recognize that and they want something better. So their belief is sincere that, that will bring us to a better condition. I think that it's not all just about getting away from the state. Like, they hate capitalism for a lot of the same reasons that we do.
Anarchism is, you're honestly saying that anarchism is not just all about getting away from the state.
Whenever an anarchist talks about the state, they usually also talk about capitalism as well.
Well, usually, but I do know of anarcho-capitalists who see the state as the primary impediment to the, free economy that capitalism promises us.
Aren't you talking about libertarians?
Well, there's a lot of overlap there, but I'm talking libertarians at least allow for the state. I mean, anarcho-capitalists essentially say the state can be done away with, and free, completely unfettered capitalism is the anarchist sort of ideal society for them.
That sounds really terrifying.
Well, sure, it sounds terrifying to you because you have a completely different vision of the role of the state and of society and of history and particularly of capitalism.
What, you mean like the state can provide, social assistance and a social safety net that is good?
Sure, but by tying all those things to the state, you're talking about essentially undermining the moral value of those things. Because if the state is evil, then surely nothing that comes from the state can be good.
Well, otherwise it's just propping up a corrupt system.
Yeah, where you're just paying off people to sort of accept oppression.
Well, to be fair, the social safety net kind of is that. It is just trying to balance out the injustices of capitalism to make society more bearable.
Yeah, I mean, most of the time at least. I do think a lot of the social systems, welfare states, and things like that exist were created to actually try to help people.
Well, they were mostly the result of organized labor fighting for people's rights.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. But because it's associated with the state, it surely must not be allowable.
Well, if you have a bureaucrat that's overseeing a system to distribute wealth, then you're giving power to that bureaucrat, and that can't be allowed.
No, it's completely inappropriate in that case. I don't think it would be. I mean, it is just about a morality at that point. It's about moralizing about human behavior and not actually trying to analyze human behavior and society and history.
Well, people generally put faith in leaders. I think that it only stands to reason that you have some people that are elected and held to account to be leaders and to change things and to maybe have some sort of authority, not unfettered authority and not unaccountable. But I think that's just necessary in just getting things done and having an organized society that takes everyone's interests into account.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that, at least insofar as those leaders are accountable. But you are kind of generalizing the point a fair bit there. Because, I mean, there are the political and economic system is kind of what dictates the relevance of those leaders.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you can't change the economic and political system, then we may very well just be left with choosing between leaders who really have no appreciable value.
But the whole point of anarchism is to change the political and economic system, though, so you can't really lob that against them. Like, they want things changed fundamentally as well.
Maybe they do. It's hard to say, though. I mean, honestly, I've seen more. If we're talking about like just pure results, anarchism doesn't have a hell of a lot to show for it.
Well, they're just waiting for the time when they have that one direct action at that one time, the right placard, the right billboard, and the right space, and that will just get the right media attention that will just have everyone just wake up.
Is that going to happen in my lifetime, though?
Well, there's no way to tell. We just have to keep going at it,
Well, what's the point then? I mean, it's one thing to say that we're talking about, a change in society that's going to take decades or something. But to tell me that, I may or may not even see the beginning of that like the most basic aspects of changing society may not even occur at all.
Yeah, but the more of us that are involved in this direct action, the more likely it will be that will happen.
This sounds like a Ponzi scheme. You just keep getting people to join, and then it'll work, surely. At some point, if we get enough people to join up and believe in anarchism, then it'll just work. And I can't tell you how.
I think maybe that is one area where we differ. Not you and I, but anarchists and the rest of the left. Where, if there was a law that a socialist party was putting forward that would help working class people in their daily lives, that they might not even want to take part in it because it's a political party, and just taking part in a political party is recognizing the system. Like, if it helps people, then you should support it and help it pass. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, that involvement isn't going to validate the state at all. Like, if the whole point is to improve the lives of working people, and every step that you can take to do that should be taken.
Yeah, and any arena in which we can fight for those issues is worth fighting in,
including the political one.
You don't personally have to run for politics, but if you say take part in an election or organize, say, a meeting to just debate political ideas, that's something anyone can do.
Instead of banning people from endorsing political parties on your space or not participating in that sphere at all, that really, though, the whole not participating in politics thing, to me, seems like surrendering an entire theater of war because the battle is too difficult to be fought. I think those battles are the most important because they are the most difficult to fight.
Yeah, politics is annoying. It's hard. It's difficult. It oftentimes is corrupting because it's so important. Because that's where decisions are actually being made.
Yeah, and it dictates people's lives, and you can't just ignore that because the system is corrupt. The system has to be changed, so you have to participate in it. You can't just ignore it and expect it to go away.
Well, you can... I mean, in the case of some anarchists, you can't ignore it, and you can go away. You can go off and form a farm somewhere with you and your friends, and you can just sort of build that ideal society all on your own and, screw the rest of the world because they're just beyond help.
I once thought that sort of thing would work, but then I thought that the rest of the world would still spiral out of control, and that global warming would come into place, and that the sea levels would rise, and whatever fantasy island I was living on at the time would just get engulfed by the oceans, and I could do nothing about it. And if only I had struggled with the fight with everyone else ahead of time, I could have avoided being drowned.
Yeah, well, everyone wants to get away from it, eh?
Yeah,
that's sort of like this sort of a dream people have, just to buy an island and live on it.
I want
and
an
get
island. I think that too. It would be great. As a vacation home, maybe, but I mean, you don't just want to cut off your ties completely because the rest of society fucking matters.
You could build the world that you want to see. You could engineer your own perfect society.
It's not a society if you only have 10 people. Fuck.
Well, sure it is. I mean, anarchism doesn't put any limits on the number of people you need to have a proper society.
Well, three's, two's company, three's a crowd.
And four is a, a state? It's not hard to, find enough people to do almost anything.
Well, I think they'd run into the same problems that Robert Owen had when he tried to create those perfect societies in North America. Yeah, when he took all these poor destitute people from the British Isles and said, hey, let's make this perfect society in North America, in Utah, where we have all this land. And then they all got scurvy and couldn't make enough food, and it was shit.
Well, I suppose you, as a better leader, would be aware of that problem and be willing to, ensure that they had enough oranges or vitamin C pills, that you would be smart enough.
Mac, this is precisely why you need a national program, is because you need those resources that everyone needs to share, and you can't just have these little pimple-ass communities in, all strewn out in nowhere. People need to work together, and different communities and different nations need to work together to share and to build something that works for everyone, and that requires some structure and a state, for now at least.
Or at the very least. I mean, if the honest to God goal is to actually improve people's lives, then yes, you do need that. If the goal is just to destroy the state, then you don't need anything at all but, a rock to throw through a window.
Fuck you, mailbox. Fuck you, Starbucks window. I hate you.
Yeah. I guess it is one of those major differences between anarchism and essentially every other sort of political philosophy. That every other political philosophy seems to have it in mind that there is a sort of progression to society, that things are generally getting better, that things are leading up to something. Maybe it's socialism or it's some other system of government, but that there is some direction to history generally. And in the case of anarchism, it seems like all that we're just sort of waiting for the moment when all this awfulness just ends, just finally dies.
When they make some sort of one big union,
one big co-op, whatever,
and then the state just sort of dissolves and is never to be seen from again,
like in a movie,
because it's just irrelevant now, because we've just made that transition. And it ignores the process that things have to actually function differently, and you can't just make this magic shift.
Yeah, I mean, if you've ever done anything where you actually had a goal in mind, you know that it requires a bit more than just
it happens.
It happens, right? Like there is always nothing happens hypothetically, you know. Nothing ever actually occurs in a hypothetical state. There's always some specific course of action that's taken, and unless you have some way of addressing when specifics come about, then I don't really have much of an interest in sort of a philosophy that can't deal with reality.
With specifics, because if you're using consensus, then any specific thing could be brought up to derail the entire meeting and make it last until midnight.
Yeah, let's say ideally, everyone who's in that room agrees with each other. What if a crazy person just happens to wander in and disagrees with everyone else in the room? I mean, what do you do in that situation? Do you tell them to leave? Do you let them have their time for however long they want to filibuster about whatever brain-addled thing they want to talk about?
And the funny thing about consensus-based anarchist groups is that usually that is what happens. Is that the person that is consistently disagreeing and like stopping the meetings, they're just like, hey, listen, you're not really on the same page as us. Can you just not come? And then, what kind of democracy is that? I mean, if you are purposely putting in a system where every single individual's can derail the entire thing because you need consensus, and you're still willing to exclude those people that might disagree more often, then why do you have consensus at all? I mean, that's just admitting that model of democracy is flawed if you need to exclude people from it. So that's why you need a majority vote, or a 2/3 majority vote, or whatever. People need to come together in spite of their differences. Democracy involves losing sometimes. Democracy involves just getting used to that and working with other people and taking everyone's interests into account and just dealing with the consequences sometime. And maybe sometimes you're on the losing side, but in a real democratic system, everyone wins most of the time, and that's what counts.
And in a real democracy, even when you lose, it means that you get to see whether or not your opponent's ideas actually work. Because that's the ones that get applied at that point. I mean, the whole point of an honest democracy is one where, win or lose, an idea gets applied, we see if it works, and on the basis of that, we then go forward with new ideas and new plans. And that's basically how we need to look at anarchism, whether or not it's able to achieve the goals that it sets out to achieve. Not so much even the philosophical underpinnings of it, but just if we are honest about what we want to do, then we can honestly just judge anarchism on the basis of how well it's able to enact the ideas it wants to see in the world.